Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and good morning to some. This is Andy Bastable from Oxfam, welcoming you to this webinar. It seems that we've got 44 people online of a potential 101. Okay, so this is kind of a 1.5 hour webinar, and we'll be aiming to keep it to that. And the idea is that I think you've got instructions on how to send us questions via the chat box function. So send questions at any point as we go along. Okay, so kind of, and then keeping people on their mics on mute if you're not talking. Okay, so this is the webinar on the Humanitarian Evidence Program. This is the partnership between Oxfam and Feinstein Center and Tufts University, funded through the Humanitarian Innovation and Evidence Program. They've been working with 30-ish authors and researchers and systematically reviewed the evidence base in response to a whole range of questions. And this is looking at grey literature as well as published literature. So that's kind of reports and evaluations as well as all the published stuff. The outputs of these published works have been kind of published in 8 systematic reviews, and we've got a number of institutions and organizations that have been involved with that, and that's quite a long list of institutions. Okay, so this is the second of the series of the 4 webinars, and today's topic is understanding the impact of water, sanitation and health interventions in disease outbreak response, and the impact, the second bit, is the impact of market support interventions on household food security in humanitarian crisis. So for this kind of first part on the impact of water, sanitation and health, We are joined by Daniel Langtain, co-author of the WASH Evidence Synthesis from Tufts University. Welcome, Danielle. And secondly, for the household food security part, we're joined by Helen Dulard, co-author of the Market Supports Evidence Synthesis, and she is the president of Key 8 Consulting. Thank you both for joining us. So for now, Danielle is going to set the scene for the WASH Evidence Synthesis. Danielle, I hope you're there and listening, and kind of over to you now for setting the scene.
Hi, I just wanted to thank Andy and Hep and everyone who's on the call today. And so I think right now on the screen what I'm seeing is an introduction. There we go, that's perfect. So just in terms of the water, sanitation, and hygiene evidence in outbreaks, there were 4 research questions we really looked at in this systematic review. So the first research question was a very traditional systematic review research question on health impacts. What are the health impacts of WASH interventions in disease outbreaks? And as you can see from the F diagram, which is the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the ideal is that these WASH interventions, a toilet barrier, a water barrier, or a hygiene barrier, would break the routes of transmission from the feces of an infection person getting into a new host, and then reduce the disease burden, and that's the ultimate goal. We had 3 other research questions looking at more subtle aspects of programming. What are important WASH program design and implementation characteristics in disease outbreaks in order to obtain the results you'd like to obtain in terms of disease reduction? What are the population-related barriers and facilitators that affect WASH interventions in disease outbreaks? And what are the economic outcomes of WASH interventions in disease outbreaks? So it's essentially, there's the large health impact outcome, but essentially 3 outcomes that look at program design, population barriers, and the costs that build additional evidence on beyond just the health impact. If you can go to the next slide. So in our review, we looked, as Andy mentioned, we looked at gray literature and manuscript literature from search engines and databases. In the end, we looked at about 15,000 documents that came into our main database. We reviewed these, we removed duplicates, we had a title screening to ensure that they were actually about water, sanitation, and hygiene in outbreaks. Then we had about 1,500 pass the title screen. Then we looked at the abstract. We had about 380 pass abstracts, and then 47 of those documents met our final inclusion criteria, which essentially said they were about water, sanitation, or hygiene intervention in an outbreak, and they had some type of measurement of an outcome. It wasn't just we distributed aquatabs in a cholera outbreak. It was we distributed aquatabs in a cholera outbreak and we evaluated something about the program. We looked at free chlorine residual or what people said about them or qualitative data. There was some type of outcome. So in the end, we had 47 documents included in the full review. And that would be next slide. One thing I want to comment about this is most of the documents actually had a high risk of bias. The quantitative documents, which were mostly on water supply or water treatment, had the lowest risk of bias in the documents, but still over half of those documents were assessed as high risk of bias, and overall 70% of the documents included were high risk of bias. That generally just means that a lot of the methods used for gathering information in these contexts were not randomized control trials. They weren't systematic analysis. There was a lot of talking to people and seeing what they thought, qualitative, a lot of methods without control groups. And so they do come out as fairly high risk of bias data. Next slide. And so our key findings, and this looks at our 4 goals. So the first is that these WASH interventions can be effective at reducing the risk of disease and reducing disease. So we did see disease reductions, particularly from those particular interventions that are at the top right of your screen. So these are the interventions where we had quantitative evaluation methods, that's the x-axis, and we had this kind of moderate quality of evidence. So particularly around the household water treatment with chlorine tablets, source-based treatment, well disinfection, household water treatment with other options, we saw a number of quantitative studies of low and moderate levels of evidence that showed that you could either reduce the disease burden itself or you could reduce the risk of disease, i.e. your water was cleaner, so you would expect the disease to reduce. Now, what we saw on the other end of it with the qualitative and low quality of evidence, much of the sanitation work, much of the hygiene work, much of the social mobilization work, much of the work that's more the softer side of WASH has been very poorly evaluated. And one thing I want to pull out here is WASH package, which is the term we're using for, you're not just giving out chlorine tablets, you're giving out chlorine tablets and soap and a hygiene kit and all of this. And this is the majority of how programs are actually implemented in outbreaks. People don't just receive one thing, they receive a package of interventions from responding organizations. That was very poorly evaluated. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what's evaluated and what's actually done. We found 4 program characteristics that led to kind of program success: simple interventions, interventions that were pre-positioned and distributed in a timely manner, interventions that were community driven and that the community wanted, and interventions that the beneficiary population knew about beforehand. So we're linked into development interventions that were occurring before the emergency, and then we're linked into development interventions that occurred after the emergency. And that's, so it's familiarity with the interventions. And then there were 4 barriers and facilitators that were noticed: taste and smell, when the product changed the taste and smell, either for better or for worse. That could be a barrier or facilitator. Communication methods, people preferred face-to-face and community health workers and radio. Other methods weren't as effective. Inadequate perceptions of efficacy. There were some things that were distributed that people thought were very efficacious, they'd work very well, but in fact they didn't. And so there was a disconnect between what people thought something would work and how well it actually does work. And then trust and fear, particularly in these outbreak contexts, like in Ebola and cholera, there's a lot of fear, and having an organization that the community had trust in was really an important facilitator. One thing we did find was a complete lack of any data on the costing or the cost benefit or any of that on these interventions in outbreaks. And so that was a null result in our findings. And I think that's my last slide before we turn it over. Andy, am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
Perfect. So I'll hand it back if that's the right thing to do.
Okay, so now it's over. Before questions specifically on that WASH bit, it's now over to Helen on the markets part.
Hi, great. Thanks a lot, Andy. So as you can see from the screen, we looked into the influence of market support intervention on household food security during humanitarian crisis. So first, looking at why does this question matter? A quick word about market support intervention. So markets are a central element to the lives and livelihood of most of the world population, both as a means to access essential commodities and services and as a means to gain an income. So in the recent years, mostly thanks to the increased uptake of cash-based assistance, humanitarian actors have become increasingly conscious of the importance of considering surrounding local markets. First, as a way not to damage further those markets, and then later on as a way to boost recovery and promote more sustainable intervention. So market support intervention objective is to improve the situation of crisis-affected population by providing support to critical market system on which this population rely on for goods, services, labor, or income. So those interventions are ultimately aiming at having a knock-on positive effect on crisis-affected affected population. So this is what you can see on the diagram on the slide, right? The traditional intervention go directly from the humanitarian organization to the crisis affected people, whereas market support intervention picture on the left-hand side are indirectly supporting people by supporting market they rely on. So those interventions will target market actors, market services, market infrastructure to enhance the situation of crisis-affected people. And for the sake of this review, their food security situation. So today, there's a growing consensus on the need to consider and support market as part of humanitarian response. And we assume that this support will increase the effectiveness and impact of what we do as humanitarian. Yet to date, such assumptions are not really supported by evidence or even data. And so because markets on food security as
we lost you.
Oh, did you? Can you hear me?
No, carry on. You're back on. Yeah, carry on. It's a problem at our end.
Okay. No, so I was saying that we decided to focus on food security because this is the more advanced sector on the topic, and also to be able to draw some conclusion, right? So this review, the objective was first to assess practitioners in their response design, because gut feelings, individual or organization comfort zone are still driving a large part of the response design, mostly resulting in intervention directly targeting crisis-affected households. Second, to influence policymakers, because what we found through this evidence synthesis is that most of the barrier to market support intervention are institutional rather than contextual. And so third, we wanted to map the evidence gap, right? More traditional objective. So if we look at the next slide, please, and what the included study looked like. So we screened a total of 6,216 reports for a final 7 included studies following a similar process as the one Daniele explained. Few characteristics that are described on the right-hand side that are worth highlighting. So most of the study have been published only since the past 3 years, although research until the 90s. We have found out of 6 qualitative research, only 1 was a peer-reviewed, and the other were like rapid review, case studies, etc. So as you can see, we kept the criteria for inclusion, extremely broad to be able to include all type of qualitative studies, as long as they stated they were based on data collected from project stakeholders. In addition, no study was excluded based on quality screening, and so yet we identified only 7 studies that met those agile inclusion criteria. So looking at the next slide, please, and the findings. Thanks. So 4 key findings. So the first one, we found that 5 out of the 7 interventions included demonstrate a positive influence on the food security of disaster-affected households. So of these, 2 studies provided the most robust evidence, looking at more than 1 food security-related indicator, right? In the other 5 studies, we've used proxy indicator illustrating household outcome on food security, such as an increase in income, for example. For such effect to be realized, the timing of market support intervention is quite key. So one intervention, for example, did not have positive effects on household food security because it took place 1 year after the crisis, when households were actually already meeting their needs and most traders had already reestablished themselves. Second, the second finding is that all the intervention included in this evidence synthesis were part of wider program, right? And so market support intervention tends to be designed as a small subcomponent of larger complex program. So for example, one intervention was supporting small retailer as part of a wider food security and livelihood program, which in turn was integrated with shelter, water, and sanitation intervention. So the evidence indicate that beneficiaries have a positive opinion of this integrated approach, since it provided complete package to meet all post-crisis needs, right? Third, to be able to reach this trickling down effect that I was describing, there's need to be a consistency between the volume of market support provided and the number of households which security situation should be provided. Hence the need for sufficient coverage of targeted market actor. And last but not least, the market support intervention improve the outcome of the targeted market actors, right? So this is a little bit like running through an open door, but still it was important to find out that through those actions supporting market actor, they had a positive outcome, right? So it was mostly looking at their income being increased, and by proxy, and as it is assumed in some of the study we've reviewed, this increased their own food security situation. And just worth highlighting, one study in one study, this increases go beyond just the market actors supported, right? So it had trickling down effect as well to the whole market system stakeholders. So I'm going to stop there for now, and so back to you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you to both for that overview, and just more specifically that this research was very useful for researchers and academics, but also for informing the work that practitioners do on the ground. So first of all, the question to you, Helen, of do you have some kind of good examples from your research of sort of successful interventions based on the evidence that you found, something that will inform our practice for the future?
Maybe to give you a very quick overview of the intervention, most of which were quite successful. So they were in response to humanitarian crisis of different length, different type, in Ethiopia, Haiti, Pakistan, the Philippines, in rural context or urban context, engaging a wide range of market actors and population. And so the point I'm making here is that the limiting factor to the uptake of market support intervention are not contextual, right? Market support intervention can be appropriate in any type of context across any sectors. So maybe just to delve a little bit more in detail on two interventions that we came across, picking the one in the Philippines, so you get an idea of the range of activity that can be done in response to the same crisis. So there was an intervention implemented by Save the Children, which objective was to restore the livelihood of about 2,300 typhoon-affected households. And so in addition to supporting directly those households through cash transfer programming and through in-kind intervention, Save supported 500 small traders through a cash grant of 300 USD, which was disbursed in 2 installments. And in addition to this grant, provided capacity building to those small traders. The objective beyond the support to those traders was that they could restore their businesses, thus improving population access to food items and food products. So that was the first one. The second one was implemented by CRS, still after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, this time looking at 5,200 something household. And so again, in parallel to directly supporting those households so that they can boost their livelihood recovery and increase their food security situation, CRS supported 5 blacksmiths with a 230 USD grant so they could restore the production of quality agricultural tool. So there was first a conditionality, meaning that the trader had to produce a minimum of 300 tools before receiving the grant, which condition was then lifted to allow smaller traders to also join the program, therefore increasing the number of traders participating. Yeah, so back to you, Andy. I got much more example. One thing, sorry, before I hand over. So those examples are limited to food security because this is the sector we looked, but it's quite important to highlight that there are examples of good practices that are going beyond food security, like the wash sector, the shelter sector. And although we looked at food security, they are potential in other sectors.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So it's the same big question for you, Danielle, that you know, what can we learn, good practices from your synthesis work?
Well, I think there's an ongoing debate between what quality of evidence from the systematic review side of things do we need to have, while also thinking about what recommendations can be made to responding organizations with the information we have right now. And I think there's always a tendency to say we need more evidence, which in some cases we do and in some cases we don't. And it can always be good to have more evidence, but we also need to reflect, as you say, on what this actually means. And I think there's some really good programmatic things that came out of the review in terms of the importance of the softer side of WASH, the importance of working with the community, of providing interventions that the community is familiar with, of pre-positioning, of the logistical side of things, and this was across all interventions. It wasn't specific to water treatment or water supply. It was more of these holistic, how can programs be well implemented such that they have more of a chance to have the outcomes and impacts that are desired. And I think that type of programmatic recommendation came across both very consistently across everything we read and very strongly. And so even in the absence of it, well, it may not be the highest quality evidence, or there may only be a few studies in each individual intervention, but across it all, I think there's some real programmatic pieces that we can pull out to say, these interventions, it is possible to reduce the disease burden if the delivery of the products comes with these characteristics. Right, and if you do these things, you're much more likely to have the disease reduction. And so I think that's what I would say is the largest practical thing that came out of the review.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but do you have a practical example of where something you came across did lead to a successful outcome?
Right. So this is one of the strongest health impact studies that came in the review. Was a study done in the Ebola context. There was a community-led total sanitation program, which is about working with the community to develop their own sanitation solutions that had existed in the area before Ebola started. After the Ebola outbreak began, those same community health workers that have been working on sanitation continued working in those communities on Ebola prevention activities. Those communities were then, they did a small study to look at Ebola transmission in those communities that had the community-led total sanitation program versus communities that didn't. And they saw statistically significantly less Ebola in the communities with the community-led total sanitation program. Oh, yeah, thank you. And so that, I think what one thing is, you could say, you could come out of that and you could have a very simplistic view of the data, and you could say community-led total sanitation programs reduce Ebola. And I think that's incorrect. I think the framework that was developed in these communities for the community-led total sanitation program, the trust with the communities, the community health workers, the dissemination of information, that framework that was developed for the CLTS program was then activated to distribute information about Ebola prevention. And because the framework existed prior to the emergency, everybody trusted it. So those people came in and said, this is how you prevent Ebola. And so they were able to leverage that framework to prevent Ebola transmission. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to think about when we look at how we practically do these programs on the ground, because we can come up with some amazing outcomes leveraging what was there before. So I don't know if that's that's an example that is what you're looking for, Andy, or?
Yes, I think that's a good example, and it's a bit of a segue into the question that I want to ask you on community engagement. That's come out as a theme in the synthesis, and kind of, so that could have been your example, but have you got another one where kind of it would help agencies to sort of use community engagement as an effective tool to actually get better health outcomes? Do you have another example from the synthesis about that?
And I would say another one would be with chlorine tablets. So chlorine tablets, aquatabs, are widely distributed in emergency response and outbreaks in cholera specifically. And what we saw, this is where we have the most evidence, the highest number of studies around distribution of chlorine tablets. And what we saw was incredibly consistent data that if you just give people chlorine tablets without any community health worker, without any training, you just hand them the chlorine tablets and you say use them. About 10 to 20% of the population, give or take, that receives the tablets have used those tablets correctly and have free chlorine residual in their drinking water. And free chlorine residual in your drinking water is an indication you're reducing your risk of disease transmission, right? And so 10 to 20%, you think, okay, that's not great. Well, that's better than zero, but we'd like it better. What we can see, and we saw this in a few programs where community health workers were implemented, where there were visits to the household, where there were trainings, where there was materials distributed in the local language. And there was a Action Contre la Femme program I'm pretty sure it was Sudan, but I can't look at it right. I don't have it in front of me right now. And there was another program in Haiti where we saw these incredibly high numbers of 80 to 90% of the beneficiary population having free chlorine residual in their drinking water from the aquatabs. And so you're talking about the difference really. Yes, if you just throw the aquatabs out of a truck, 10 to 20% of people are going to use them. But if you want the 80 to 90%, this community engagement, this working with the community, this community health worker, training materials on appropriate languages, distribution of cards in Creole that say how to use it, that's really going to pop your outcomes up much, much higher.
Thank you. Yes. Would you therefore agree with the statement that the success of any point of use chlorination program is directly proportional to the amount of follow-up visits and support and monitoring?
Yeah, and I would actually add a bit to that. I'd say it's, do people know about the household water treatment, point of use water treatment intervention before the emergency? That's been shown to really correlate with use afterward. You give something new that it's confusing, it's different. So their knowledge before and the follow-up afterward. And I think for the simple, we found a difference between the simple interventions like chlorine tablets, add a tablet, wait 30 minutes, versus the more complex interventions that require maintenance and back flushing. And so you think about, there is a baseline amount of training and follow-up and monitoring needed afterward, but that amount of training and monitoring and follow-up increases with the increasing number of steps in the household water treatment option. So 2 steps, you might need this much follow-up and training, but if you're talking about 5, 6, 7 steps to use the option, you need more. So that's, I think, so I generally agree and expand on what you said.
Great, thank you. So Helen, slightly different one for you, that on the key actors to engage in the market support interventions, kind of who would they be, and what would that engagement look like?
I mean, I'm gonna use the same question as the one you had for Danielle, if you don't mind, just to make the points, looking at community engagement and more than engagement, try to make the case for the lens with which we are looking at markets, right? So this is also what we found by reviewing evidence, right? Is from the start of the situation analysis, we should really aim to get away from our agency-centric perspective. And when it comes to market, many market analysis ask the question, how can we, as humanitarian, use local market to deliver humanitarian assistance. So we strongly make the case in the review that an alternative should be in looking at things in a people-centric manner. So as opposed to asking how we as humanitarian can use the market, we should be asking how communities are using and accessing markets to cover the needs, and how we can help market to restore their ability to do that. And that should be leading to an increased uptake of market support intervention, right? Because as a result of the focus of those analysis only on using the market, they do not necessarily include a wide range of options for different type of market-based programming, hence a very little number of interventions that are looking at supporting markets despite the potential this may have. And this is back to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. And then to continue with you, Helen, then that looking at some of the gaps in the evidence that you kind of found in the synthesis, can you talk us through sort of the gaps in the evidence?
Sure. Maybe if you can, I think there is a slide on this, no?
That's right.
Okay. Okay, so this is Daniele. Maybe the next one. Okay, perfect. So the gaps that we found are actually twofold, right? So there is a lack of intervention per se that can be reviewed and can be documented and then reviewed, and then a lack of evidence on the existing intervention, right? And so just as a disclaimer, despite the paucity of available evidence, the evidence synthesis really illustrates a largely positive influence of market support intervention on household food security and also trader incomes, right? That being said, the evidence we found was very limited in terms of quantity, analytical rigor, diversity of example and context, and also intervention scale, right? So looking first at the lack of intervention, the rationale for this that we came across was first a lack of funding available for market support intervention, considering, just to make a parallel, that the funding for all cash transfer programming is estimated to be only 7% of the overall humanitarian funding. I think it's safe to speculate that funding for market support intervention is even significantly lower. Second, what I've mentioned, the fact that market assessments are of narrow scope, right? So we are not necessarily looking at the need and the appropriateness of market support. Hence, we come up with very little market support intervention. Hence, there is little evidence as to what could be the effect of such intervention, right? So most of the humanitarian operation aim to use the market in one or more ways, but they do not yet support it. Neither intend to redress any negative impact of humanitarian intervention on the market system, because there is not such a market-neutral humanitarian intervention. And a final thing that we found is that the humanitarian infrastructure support program, so those massive road rehabilitation operation from the lot cluster, etc., do not include household outcomes, right? So there would be a huge scale road rehabilitation, such as what was done in Nepal, but we are not monitoring what the effects of those infrastructure on household outcome. And similarly, the activities undertaken as part of the regular humanitarian supply chain are not tracked or considered as market support intervention, whereas with no doubt some would qualify as market support intervention. And so looking now at the lack of evidence, I'm not going to say something new by saying that humanitarian actors are quite bad at collecting and using evidence, and this is not specific to market support intervention. What was specific is that we came across intervention where private sector actors supported other private sector actors following a disaster. For example, after Haiyan, again in the Philippines, we know that Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble, in partnership with USAID, they rebuilt and restocked about 1,000 grocery stores and trained the traders. And yet, while we know this took place, and despite us trying very hard to access any documentation, we've not been able to access data on such type of intervention. And so given the limited documentation available on the effectiveness of market support intervention, we've listed quite a number of further area for research. And this is a bit of a teaser, right, for you to read the report, because all those questions are mentioned in there. And back to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you. So it's the same question for Danielle on gaps. You need to go back a slide. There we are. You're away.
I think the gap that we really saw was a little bit of what I mentioned before, which was these commonly implemented interventions, this disparity between what's actually researched and what's actually commonly used in response. And we saw no evidence in the outbreak context on incredibly common WASH interventions in outbreak response. So water trucking, well rehabilitation, bucket chlorination, latrine building, hand washing, household spraying with chlorine to prevent cholera transmission, environmental cleanup. These are all, they have a bit of a history of interventions that have been done for so long that they're just common. We have data from the 1930s when household spraying was done to prevent cholera transmission in China. And so we know these programs have happened for close to 100 years in some cases, but no one's ever gone back and shown whether or not they work. What's the efficaciousness? What's the effectiveness? And so there's some filling in, like, yes, providing water with a truck is going to be good for a family in terms of water supply, but is that water clean? And what's the cost effectiveness of that? And so I think there's these commonly implemented but severely under-researched interventions that we need to fill in the gaps for. We also need to look at wash package, which is not that it's very easy to design a study to look at one intervention, like how is chlorine tablets in this context, but that's not how the real world works in an emergency context. And so how do we really work around a beneficiary family or household that's receiving 5 interventions from 5 different organizations? How does that fit together? And I think that's going to require new study designs. And then I know there was a question, and I just wanted to address that briefly. There is qualitative data can provide moderate or high levels of evidence, provided the qualitative data is collected in a rigorous way. And so there's qualitative data that's like, oh yeah, I talked to this person and that's what they said, and I'm writing down a few quotes they said, and that's pretty low quality evidence. But then there's qualitative data where you do a number of focus groups and you analyze that data and you pull out the themes and you select quotes that are representative of the themes and you do kind of network analysis. There's very rigorous ways to collect and analyze qualitative data. And I think that would be another gap, I would say, is filling in this gap where right now the qualitative data is showing very low and low evidence. And that doesn't mean that it all has to. There could be high quality qualitative data, and that's a gap missing right now in the WASH and outbreak space. So that's what I would say, this kind of filling in the under-researched interventions, filling in this gap around the high quality qualitative research, and filling in this gap on how things are actually implemented versus how things are actually researched would be those 3 gaps I think really came out of the review.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So, I mean, both of you have said really there's not enough evidence, but I think I heard it more clearly from you, Danielle, that so then the question is, okay, we do need more evidence of kind of WASH outcomes, health outcomes from WASH interventions. So what can we do for future programs and for future research to make sure that we do get more evidence from the field? So suggestions and practical ways forward on how do we improve the evidence base?
And I think the first thing is to get away from researching the easy stuff that we already have a lot of evidence on. We don't need a ton more research on chlorine tablets, for example, right? And that's very easy because it's got this nice outcome of free chlorine residual. But thinking about how to fill in these harder gaps And that involves, I'd also say it's getting a little bit away from thinking everything has to be a randomized control trial. You have to have a control group and you have to follow a recipient or beneficiary group and look at the differences. I think there's a lot of work we can do within these interventions that starts in a laboratory setting and then continues on to the field to see if they can even be efficacious and effective. And I'll give an example from particularly household spraying, which is where generally a responder comes into a household with a backpack of chlorine on their back, and they spray the household with chlorine in order to reduce intrafamilial transmission of cholera. So if a patient presents at a cholera treatment center, then a responder is sent out to spray their household. So there's a number of questions about this. It's been done, we have data from 1930s and that it was done in China. Okay, so it's been done almost 100 years. We literally do not have laboratory data that shows when you spray chlorine of a certain concentration on representative household surfaces, like dirt or blankets or ceramic plates or clothing, that if there's cholera on those surfaces and you spray chlorine, that it will even kill that cholera. And so for that one, the first thing I'd say is actually to go into the laboratory, put cholera on common representative household surfaces, spray it with chlorine, and see if it can even be efficacious. And if it's not, that's enough to say, hey, we really need to think about whether or not we even promote this intervention as an option, right? And then after we show that these commonly implemented but severely under-researched interventions can be efficacious in the laboratory setting, go into the field setting and say, okay, how is it implemented? Is it effective? Like, what is the chlorine concentration in these tanks? These tanks are metal most of the time. Is all the chlorine reacting immediately? And so then thinking about how is it effective? Can it even be implemented effectively in the field? And after getting the efficacy and the effectiveness intervention, then think about health impact. So I think there's really a sense of like we need to think about lab efficacy first, field effectiveness, health impact, and then costs. Because if you can have efficacy, effectiveness, and health impact, but it's $1 million a person, that's not going to be an intervention we're going to work with in the future. And so I think it's that kind of chain of thinking that we need to go back to fill in. And there's a lot of, and this isn't go to an emergency and talk to some people and see if they have free chlorine and residual in their drinking water from a chlorine tablet. This is a more complex research chain, and I think that's where we need to go in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. That's more of the what, but when agencies have tried with their own staff to get them to collect evidence, and other times when we've tried to get researchers into emergency situations where in the hustle and bustle and chaotic first phase interventions, that hasn't always worked. So how would you say on the how, what would you say about, in your view, the best way to get that evidence?
Absolutely. So I think in terms of the how, I think external pre-positioned funding and pre-positioned protocols really help, because I think you're exactly right, Andy, that in the hustle and bustle of an emergency, like Oxfam staff isn't gonna, they're responding, they're not gonna be able to assist a researcher or, you know, develop a protocol. That's not the role. The role is to respond and to save lives. But if there can be an external donor that said, okay, we'd like to evaluate this, we're going to have funding for a researcher to work with a responder. We're going to have protocols set up before the emergency. We're going to have funding allocated that's separate from all the rest of the emergency funding. The researcher is going to come in and be funding independent, so not depending on the responders for funding, and then work with the responders to do the research and have partnerships, and have those partnerships be that there's concerns and there's been issues with researchers coming in and taking data and not sharing and then getting the results without talking to the organization. Having those organizations be partners in the research, making sure they can review documents before they go out, review presentations, review manuscripts before they're delivered, but have that all be a partnership, but have that funding be pre-positioned with pre-positioned protocols, such that you're not trying to do this in the hustle and bustle of the acute emergency response.
Wow, we look forward for that that wonderfully perfect scenario, which we'd hope to aim for. We would, you know, that's a good response. So, Helen, have you got anything to add on that same subject?
Maybe just to go back to what I think should be the first question is first to define what you need the evidence for, right? If you want to set the bar at the right level in terms of how strong and rigorous your evidence should be, I think it needs to be thought through a practitioner point of view, right, as to how this evidence can be useful for programming, to influence policies, etc. You're going to need different level of evidence depending on what you want to do with it. I think also that there's a need to recognize the limits of humanitarian context in terms of the type of research method you can implement, right? Looking at food security, there's definitely some ethical issue with randomized controlled trials. So I'll definitely go in the same direction as Daniele here and make the case for stronger qualitative research, which is often disregarded, and the number of people who don't know what data saturation is, even though they're doing research, is quite high. So there's definitely a space there. So that's the first practical recommendation in terms of strengthening the body of evidence. I say that the second one is to look into how the primary data can be embedded from the start in intervention design for market support intervention. In a few pilots, right, where you think that there's likely to be less disruption due to an increase in crisis or a conflict, something. And so that could be deemed representative of similar context or similar activity, in the sense that you do not necessarily need to research every context, every type of market support intervention, but you could pick some that could serve as evidence for the rest of the sector. A little bit what happened with cash as well.
Thank you. Another full answer. Now, you're not off the hook yet. There's various questions coming now. The first one is around kind of the additional difference. This is for you, Danielle. That's the additional difference in the community-led total sanitation communities in Liberia is that the likely impact of the take-up of Ebola prevention messages was that they demonstrated health awareness behaviors by choosing to participate in the community-led total sanitation program to begin with. Do you think that's a sort of a comment? Danielle, do you want to say anything, or is that a question?
No, and I agree, and that is, so the communities that were part of that were communities that had participated in CLTS, and so yes, there is a bias that those communities were more predisposed to participate in the CLTS, and so they participated, and so yes, it may not be completely applicable to it's not completely applicable to every community, but I think the main theme of if you have an existing way to disseminate information that people trust, that is something that can be leveraged in an emergency to disseminate different information. And I think that's the theme to take away from there.
Yes, I agree. It's unfortunate in many situations we don't have that preparedness, any sort of kind of existing programming. Preparedness obviously makes a huge difference, and we don't always have that luxury. Okay, so there's another question, again on WASH for Danielle, around clarification on the availability and the quality of evidence of WASH interventions and outbreaks. Could it be that there is high quality evidence that the intervention doesn't work? Is that been kind of a feature of your synthesis, that seeing things that actually that say they shouldn't be done again?
Well, and that's a great point. And if you can go back to the slide, the evidence synthesis slide. Yeah, thank you. One of the things, so we did a second systematic review at the same time, which was on WASH in all emergencies. So this one was just outbreaks. And in outbreaks, we didn't see anything where there was a null result, where there was no, or a net negative result. We do see things where it's very questionable, like we have questions looking at whether household spraying could even work, whether or not spraying chlorine on normal household surfaces could even work. But there was no negative or null result. In the other systematic review we did on WASH in all emergencies, we actually did see a negative result where we recommended the intervention not continue to be completed, and that was on particularly well rehabilitation in areas where there was saltwater intrusion, and this was particularly done after the South Asian tsunami, where it actually worked better to leave the well alone and let it recover on its own rather than try and rehabilitate it. So we did see that in our other systematic review, but we didn't see that in this outbreak review.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question for both of you, and it's actually a summary of a couple of questions that have come in. So Helen, this is to you first, around the basic minimum of indicators that can be monitored as part of interventions, which gets on to what is good enough for the level of evidence that we need. So to say something around kind of what is a good enough evidence, what evidence that we're aspiring to in both the market support work and the WASH work. So Helen, over to you.
I mean, I think that the question to ask first would be, what do you need the evidence for, right? So to have a pragmatic approach as to what is needed. When it comes to market support intervention at the moment, there's definitely a need to collect strong evidence as to if at all, if those intervention works, right? So the evidence we've collected, they demonstrate that it has a positive effect on household food security, but in terms of scope, in terms of scale, this was very limited. So a little bit, as I was mentioning before, there's definitely a case to be made for resources to be put into collecting strong primary data, because there is also a current lack of intervention, right? So partnering with organizations implementing market support as we speak. So data collection and research could be embedded right from the start of the intervention. Not necessarily looking at randomized controlled trial, but just looking at a rigorous research protocol that could aim to demonstrate that this has positive effect, but not positive effect out of the blue, positive effect compared to the regular, more traditional type of intervention we've been implementing, right? So two things: draw as to what you need the evidence for, and second, try to demonstrate the effect compared to what we've been doing so far, right? So to have the analysis compared to not doing anything versus what we've been doing so far versus doing market support intervention, as opposed to try to only look at market support intervention in a silo. That would be from my end.
Thanks, and over to Danielle.
And I would really echo what was said about what is the evidence needed for. And in a lot of cases, we see a push toward we need randomized control trials to develop, systematic reviews and meta-analysis to determine health impact and have this kind of more academic sense. And my sense in many cases in an emergency context, which are rapidly evolving, changing over time and not static, we need to have enough evidence to know what is the best options to implement in this emergency context that has the highest chance of reducing the disease transmission, and so that we can say that clearly to donors and to responsible agencies to say this is what we should do. So to me, it's much more about the decision making in the particular context and the decision making and the funding for it. Because if we can say we know this will reduce the disease transmission, it becomes a much stronger call for funding, and we know this is the cost of it, and we know this is the benefit, and that type of information will help as we move forward in these emergencies, which they're emerging, they're different, they're evolving, and I think we need to have kind of a flexible research program that reflects that.
Okay, and for practitioners, is there anywhere they could go to get an indication of the level of rigor that they need to put into which type of research for which type of program they're trying to evaluate? Is there somewhere to give us guidance? That's to you, Danielle.
Oh, I think, unfortunately, if I was going to say for the entirety of the WASH sector, no. There's very good guidance on how to monitor and evaluate household water treatment that's come out of World Health Organization. There's some individual pieces that there's very good guidance on, but I don't see, like for the specific interventions, like how do you evaluate well rehabilitation, I don't see that. There are some general, how do you conduct evaluations, or how do you conduct research, how to, intro to epi type things that are run through the certain universities, or London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, or Emory, or and then some things that are partnerships between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the WASH cluster in terms of providing information. There's the Emergency Environmental Health Forum in terms of raising the level of research and disseminating that. But I think you're right that there isn't a holistic across the WASH space research agenda and research recommendations. And I think there's been some movement with R2HC in thinking about how to start that, and the WASH cluster is beginning to consider that. And I think that would be a great piece for the WASH cluster and R2HC and all of that to think about moving forward, because there is much more of a need for something holistic rather than piecemeal.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, it does seem then that if kind of various countries and agencies in countries are looking at kind of what sort of a researcher or an agency person and the rigor, then it's actually a bit of they have to do a bit of investigation on, you know, defining what they want to research and how, that it's not put on a plate for people, as it were. Could this be a reason why actually we have a lack of evidence in the sector?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Is there a need for some better either guidelines or something? I mean, do we all need more guidelines? That'd be one question, but how else can we actually enable people to work out how best to do the research at field level?
Right, and I think that's both having things pre-prepared on a plate, but also these partnerships between responding organizations and researchers. Because I think it's very fair to say that the responders need to focus on the emergency response piece of it, but how can they partner? What are the skills to bridge those? Can there be a responder who can bridge to a researcher, and a researcher who can bridge to the responder? And that's really where the evidence base will develop.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, getting back to the questions. Okay, Helen, the question here is around time-related programming for market-based approaches in different phases of humanitarian response. That's a good question. Do you want to address that one?
Sure, and maybe just to flag a few things regarding the evaluation bits you've mentioned earlier on. Again, looking at a pragmatic side of things and looking at the resources available, I think it's also a matter of aligning what you're looking for through an evaluation versus the resources you have for this particular evaluation. So having 30 evaluation question when you have 20 days of work is not realistic. So you are always going to end up with a result which is going to be of poor quality. So there's definitely an element here as to aligning expectation with resources. And just pointing a great resource that has been recently published, which is not specific to the food security sector, neither with the WASH, but is applicable across sector, is the ALNAP guide on evaluating humanitarian action. So quite actionable, practical step-by-step guidance that I recommend everyone to have a look at, including evaluation managers. So having said that, and looking at the timing side of things, as I was mentioning earlier, so market support intervention or supporting markets is not bound to a specific moment or to a specific crisis, neither a specific context, right? So it's applicable in humanitarian context. It's also applicable in the long run and in more development-oriented context. So the market support intervention we looked at for the review have had various lengths of time, from 6 months to 5 years, although not originally designed for 5 years, right? Because what we really focused on was market support intervention in humanitarian context, and we didn't look at those interventions which were aiming at longer term outcomes. Those interventions, the longer term one, have been more documented than the humanitarian one. And one of the objectives of the systematic review was also to make the statement with certainty that there is a lack of evidence and that there is a lack of intervention, right? That was the working hypothesis right from the start, the team doing the review being expert matter as opposed to academics, right? So we had the sense that we were not going to find a lot of evidence, but we wanted to demonstrate this with certainty. Hence, we limited the scope to crisis settings, right? And we haven't looked into the longer term intervention who have been more documented because they've also been implemented for a longer period of time. And
okay, sorry, we're going to finish off there. I was going to ask you a further one, Helen, slightly different on kind of the how we do this. One of the questions around should it be built more into the cluster system approach? So do you agree, Helen, that if the clusters took this on board more seriously and made some standards and indicators around it, that we might see a change?
I think that the greatest opportunity for market support intervention is actually the increased uptake of cash transfer programming, right? So the question you're asking is almost like, how should we coordinate market-based intervention, which is as simple to answer as to how should we coordinate cash transfer programming. I'm not sure anyone in the room has an answer yet, but definitely, as you've mentioned, Andy, it passed through both cluster level so that the different sector gets on board and aware with market support intervention. That has been the case already quite a lot with the WASH sector, as you know better than I do. But beyond looking at cluster level, also looking at the inter-cluster, right? There is a lot of debate around cash-based intervention in the inter-cluster. It's a great opportunity to make the case for market there, because markets are a prerequisite for cash-based assistance, right? So if everyone is so excited about increasing the uptake of cash-based assistance, they should get as excited as to support market, hence increasing market support interventions.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I understand the point, but sort of pointing the question a bit more in the way of, is it a lack of baseline data in the initial phase of the emergency? And if the cluster demands greater baseline data, would that help in the kind of evidence collection, which it may do, but I'll push that one to Danielle. Have you got any thoughts about, is it the cluster that should be more pushing the evidence-based thing, or is it a different way about individual agencies taking more responsibility? And you can't say both.
Oh, but I was gonna say both, Andy. I think the individual agencies often have their own particular research interests or interests within a space. And so, for example, some agencies are very interested in washing nutrition, and some agencies are very interested in outbreaks, or some agencies are very interested in hepatitis E. And I think what we see is, I think those agencies should lead in their own particular interests. They have the most experience, they might know the most about it, but there does need to be some type of coordination level. If this agency is particularly interested in this, and this agency is particularly interested in this, because if each agency does it just individually, there's going to be gaps, and there's a sense of and there's going to be duplicated effort. So I do feel like it is both. Sorry. Over to you, Andy. Andy?
We can hear you, Danielle. I think it's Andy we've lost.
Hi, everyone. This is Roxanne Cristalli, the Humanitarian Evidence Program Manager at Feinstein. We received a question on costs. Why is the cost information lacking, and what can we do to close the gap? And a few panelists have pointed out that, for example, in certain responses such as Haiyan, cost information does exist. So how was that taken into account? We'll start with Danielle, but the same question will also go to Helen.
Right, and so I would say one of the first things is, in any systematic review, there is the first thing that's done is a bounding of the questions. And in this systematic review, the question was released, and that decision was made above my level, that this systematic review would be on outbreaks specifically. So the inclusion criteria for data into this systematic review was it had to be an outbreak. And we had a whole set of what is an outbreak, what does it mean to be an outbreak, what outbreaks are we prioritizing. In the end, what was included, because we had inclusion criteria, but then what is the data actually out there? The vast majority of the included documents are from cholera, with a couple Hep E and a couple Ebola. And that's kind of what the evidence base is from. In that, in particular, Haiyan doesn't meet those inclusion criteria. And so even though it's an emergency, it's not an outbreak. And so that data wasn't included. And so this is not to say there's no evidence on cost and wash. It's to say there's no evidence on cost and wash in outbreaks. And so that's what, to just answer that specifically. And I also think the costing data is really hard to come by, because often it's not broken up, and agencies not breaking it up. They're not saying this is the cost for the staff that did this water program, this is the cost for this. The emergency money isn't tracked at that level, and so we've had trouble getting it. We know the cost of the product, or we know the cost of the, there were 10 community health workers hired, but to get it all the chains of all the costs through the logistics and the shipping, and to take that apart from the other emergency response activities, we've had a real hard time being able to get that information from responders, partially because it's not separated like that, and partially because they really don't want to share it. And I understand both of that, but I think there needs to be some specific research on costing that's not just part of another research, but it's specific to the costing. I don't know if that's if that answers the question, and I can turn it over to Helen, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, from my end, from the market support intervention, and I totally support what you've said, Danielle, regarding the lack of willingness to share budgeting, data, etc. But in addition, so the question for market support intervention would really be, is it worth the money, right? Is it worth supporting traders who are not the most vulnerable, and to direct to them some scarce humanitarian resources? We're not there yet when it comes to market support intervention, because the sector hasn't defined what a successful market support intervention looks like, right? What they have been monitoring is mostly the outcome of market support intervention on household, but not necessarily the direct effect of those intervention on market. So there is an intermediate step in between as to answer, is it worth the money, which would be, does it work, right? So that I guess it's a phased process to be able to answer the cost related questions. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Roxanne or Andy.
Okay, yes, I've dropped out and now I've dropped in. So another question on the board is around more systematic reviews planned on the impact of WASH. So this is for you, Danielle, about is there any more planned and in other emergencies than just disease outbreaks? If not, would the results be different from this review, both in terms of quality and of the analysis and what has worked? So I guess the thing is here, kind of, if there are further ones, are they going to come out with anything different? Because actually the evidence base won't have changed. So Danielle, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, there's been actually quite a lot of systematic reviews on WASH in emergencies, looking at certain aspects. And so there's been 4 or 5 that have published, particularly looking at the health impact side. And those summarize simply to, we have good data that household water treatment, like chlorine tablets, can have health impact, and there's not data from roughly anything else, aside from 1 or 2 studies here and there. And so those exist. There's been a number of other more holistic ones. The change about this one is just getting in the gray literature, which is unique, and the sheer number of documents, the 15,000. So it was super comprehensive, and the number of outcomes. So I think this particular included the gray literature, more holistic, and had more outcomes. And we still came up with the 47 included studies, which is relatively the good number for a systematic review, but is still relatively small from what you'd expect because there's so many interventions. To answer the second part of your question, concurrently with funding from another donor, we used the same 15,000 documents to look at a different research question, which was WASH in emergencies, so all emergencies, but short-term programs only. So you slice it different ways, right? So this was WASH in outbreaks. The other was WASH in all emergencies, but only short-term, like what's done in the first bit, more the acute emergency side. And what was interesting in that is when we sliced and diced it that way, we ended up with just over 100 included studies out of these 15,000 documents. That's also published, but what I can say is it was the same outcomes, right? We had a few more WASH interventions. We saw, as I mentioned before, that we don't recommend well rehabilitation or saltwater intrusion. That was different. But these main points around the barriers and facilitators, the implementation characteristics, the quality of evidence, those results they're not exactly identical, but if I gave a rough number, they're 90% the same. And so what I would say is actually right now, we're in a space where we've had kind of more traditional systematic reviews and meta-analyses looking at health impact. Those have been published. We've had these more holistic. We've had a couple of more donor-led reviews. They're all coming to the same points. This particularly it was bigger, included graylit, had more outcomes. It was very similar to something else. I think now what I would say is we need to take a break on the systematic reviews until we generate the evidence that the systematic reviews are saying the gaps are on. That's my personal thought. I don't know personally of any systematic reviews in the WASH emergency space that are going on right now, but that doesn't mean they aren't happening because I just might not have heard about them. So does that answer the question, Andy?
Yes, that does answer the question, a good answer. And it's a slightly different one, but the same one aimed at you, Helen, about the kind of more systematic reviews in the in the kind of market support sector.
I think when looking at systematic review and trying to look at defining the impacts of market support intervention, we somehow lack humility, right? So we are looking at defining attribution, right? What can we attribute to this intervention or this program? Whereas this is not the way people's life are structured, and it's not the way that you can make conclusion when it comes to market support intervention. Because if you remember the triangle at the beginning, and you can only imagine the number of variables that would affect this household food security situation, right? So there is the access to market, but there is also the quality of the food available in the market, the way that the household know how to cook the food, etc. So there are so many variables that I think we should look into systematic review, sure, because it has a great added value in terms of synthesizing everything that is out there, but slightly being a bit more humble as to what we are trying to demonstrate and what could be the added value of such type of intervention and humanitarian responses in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. Okay. And another question in is Danielle. This is again putting you on the spot for a tricky one that kind of you're already sort of consulting on the revision of Sphere. So this is for the WASH chapter. So is there any implications from your evidence synthesis that affect what should be in the new Sphere for WASH?
Yeah, and actually we've been on this Sphere review, which Oxfam has been sending out these great emails, and we've been reviewing, and we've been adding information and kind of providing our comments. And so the short answer to that is yes. And a bit of a longer answer that I'd love to bring in is, we don't have perfect evidence, but that doesn't mean we can't make the best recommendations with the evidence we have, because it's not like the emergencies are going to stop until we get perfect evidence. And so we live in an imperfect world where there are many emergency affected populations, and we need to do the best we can with the evidence we have. And so there's sometimes a pushback to say, you don't have perfect evidence, how can you make recommendations? And I'm like, we have to make the best recommendations we can based on the evidence we have, and then fill those gaps to make better recommendations next year. And if those recommendations change because we're better, that's great. And so I think that's reflected in Sphere, and what Oxfam is leading in terms of the Sphere, it gets revised, and we're on another Sphere revision right now. We'll put as much as we can in, and then we'll gather more and we'll make Sphere better. And I think that's an iterative process on evidence improvement that these systematic reviews play an important role in. And so that's what I say right now. And so back to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you. And Helen, one more for you. That your review was focused on market support interventions rather than market-based ones, such as cash and vouchers. So could you shed some light on how kind of complementing market support interventions with vouchers may kind of impact on affected households? Did any of that come out of your synthesis of the evidence?
Yeah, so that goes along the line of having market support intervention as being part of a broader program, right? So this is what we found in all the 7 studies, is that the market support intervention was only a subset of a larger program. And you're very right, Andy, in saying that some of those interventions have been, the complementary intervention have been delivered through voucher or through other type of cash-based assistance, right? So there is definitely an added value as having complementary direct support to households as to what's the effect of market support intervention, right? Because we are trying through market support intervention to ultimately target those who have been affected by crisis. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't be directly targeted either through voucher or cash. So there is a magnifying and amplifying effect here. And just one thing as to the relationship between market support intervention and cash transfer programming. So cash transfer programming is a way to use the local market, right? But it's also a modality that can be used to deliver market support intervention. So it has a type of both hats. And to close the loop with what you were discussing earlier with Daniele on the sphere revision, that also I'm lucky enough to be involved in. We got the cash-based assistance and the market thing part of sphere, not as a chapter, but working with each chapter lead there. And so in a way, this systematic review really helped, I think, to raise the profile of such type of intervention. And over to you, Andy.
Thank you. Okay, so that's the end of this webinar, and huge thanks to Danielle and Helen for all your hard work in doing it and in presenting it back to us, and thank you to everybody listening and asking questions. And just to remind people that the webinar is also available on Oxfam's Policy and Practice website. If you can navigate there, you're a better person than me. And that's on the HEP overview side of it. And the next webinar is on Tuesday, the 17th of October, and that's on shelter and self-recovery and urban response evidence. That's Tuesday, the 17th of October. Okay, so that's wrapping up from us in Oxford, and thank you all very much indeed. And it's goodbye from us.